Hello, church family. I hope you guys are all having an amazing day. Today we'll be reading from Micah 6:1 through 8.
Hear what the Lord says. Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And my people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, and the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require you but do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?
This is the word of God, and all people who read it say.
Thank you, Jennifer and Louise. So there is a TV show that is popular today, and it tells the story of a family who own a very large plot of land in Montana. And the story follows this family, and it's really all about their willingness to do whatever it takes to hold on to their land. What we discover throughout the show is that there are all kinds of people who want to take the land from them, whether it's Native Americans claiming it was theirs to begin with, or greedy capitalists who want to build a snow mountain there, a ski resort. And so this family will do whatever it takes, and in mob-like fashion, they will do whatever it takes, even if that means eliminating those who are a threat to their land. And what they do when they eliminate somebody is they take them to what they call the train station. And the train station is a remote place in Wyoming. They drive to Wyoming, a remote location where they dispose of the bodies. And they do it there. They drive to Wyoming because nobody's in Wyoming. And they drive there because then the only witnesses of their crime are the mountains and the hills. Today we're continuing in our series, You Callin Short, a series on the minor prophets. The minor prophets are a collection of books, 12 books, in the Old Testament, and they're 12 books that are often overlooked. And as we've seen, they're often overlooked because they are the last 12 books of the Old Testament. So many of us don't get that far when we read the Bible. And then also they are relatively short. But what we've seen already throughout this series is that there are some more fundamental reasons why these are often overlooked. And I would suggest that one of the reasons that has emerged throughout this series is that reading the minor prophets, or reading the prophets in general, is a little bit like encountering a police officer. We all know that feeling when you're driving down the highway and you look in your rearview mirror and there is a police car directly behind you. You know that sense of apprehension? And immediately you're thinking, okay, what have I done to break the law? Am I going too fast? Did I fail to put my turn signal on? And that whole time you're just hoping, praying that the police officer will go past you or maybe get off at the next exit, right? So you know that whole feeling of apprehension when that police car is in your rearview mirror. I think that's how many of us feel when we read the prophets. Because we're reading it and we're just, wait, okay, great. How is this prophet going to convict me of my sin this time around? And this analogy is good because they are, the prophets, as we've seen, they are the law enforcement officers. They enforce the covenant that was made between God and his people. The law of Moses, the primary purpose of the prophets is to enforce the law. So they are, in this respect, very much like police officer. Now, here's the thing. The only thing worse than seeing a police officer in your rearview mirror is standing in a courtroom before a jury being indicted for your crimes. And of course, that is precisely the picture that Micah draws up here in chapter 6. It's a courtroom scene where the people of God are standing before a jury and God is laying forth an indictment. Let me read again the first couple verses here. Hear what the Lord says. Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel. So we get this courtroom scene where an indictment is laid against Israel and it's presented before a jury. And look who the jury is. Look who it is. It's the mountains and the hills. They are the ones who are going to adjudicate in this little courtroom scene here. And there's a reason for this. Micah actually knows that if you go back to the original giving of the covenant, you go back to the book of Deuteronomy where we read about the law being given to Moses and this covenant being established, it's clear that from the get-go, the heavens and the earth are brought in to be the adjudicator, to judge this relationship between Israel and Yahweh. Look here, this is in Deuteronomy 30:19. It says, I call heaven and earth to witness against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life that you and your offspring may live. And so he calls heavens and earth, he calls the mountains and the hills to be the ones who will testify as to whether or not we have been obedient or not. And the reality is that the mountains and the hills are excellently positioned to judge, aren't they? Because they see everything. I mean, we're all aware of this, living in Colorado. You're driving down the highway, and maybe you see a police officer in your rearview mirror, and maybe a few choice words come out. And you look to the west, and the mountains and the hills, they see it all. You see, this is a way of saying we cannot hide our sin. Even if you dump the bodies of your victims in a valley in some remote location in Wyoming, the mountains and the hills see. It's a way of saying you can't hide this, even if you delete your search history from Google. You cannot hide your sin, and you will be called to account. Now, this, of course, raises the question, okay, that the prophets are always getting us to come back to. And that is, okay, well, what is the law? What is it that God requires of us? What is it that obedience looks like? What does disobedience look like? What does God desire of us? And the first thing that emerges in this passage is that God is not looking for religious performance. You see, the people of Israel were a very religious people. They engaged in a lot of religious activities, and they had sort of come to think, at least subconsciously, even if they wouldn't articulate this consciously, that it's because of their religious participation, this is what makes them right with God. They engage in these religious activities, and that constitutes obedience to the law. And so Micah, he calls them out for this. He kind of imagines rhetorically, he imagines an Israelite who's sort of boasting maybe about how religious they are. And so we get a picture here of a really religious person. This is in verses 6 through 7. And this really religious person is sort of, again, rhetorically, sort of maybe boasting about the way in which they perform. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And what this picture is somebody, if somebody were to do all of the things that are listed here, then they would sort of be like the poster child for the religiously faithful in 8th century Israel. A lot of what they did in their religious practice was involved the sacrificing of animals. They would take the animal to the altar and they would sacrifice it before the Lord. But most of the time what they would do is they would burn the animals like a barbecue, right? And what they would do is they would burn some of it completely up. It would just be completely burned, and that would be the smoke sort of rising would be seen as the gift to the Lord. But the truth is that they wouldn't necessarily burn the whole thing. They would cook some of it, and then they would eat it. And the priest would eat some, they would eat some of it. So they would benefit, they'd get something from this sacrifice. Okay, but there was a specific offering, a burnt offering, was when they would burn the entire carcass. So they wouldn't get any of it. It was this ultimate sacrifice. It's all going to the Lord. So this person is boasting about the amount of sacrifice that they are offering here with their religious activity. Shall I come before with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Oftentimes when they would sacrifice an animal, it wouldn't be very old. It'd just be a couple weeks old, something like that. But if they waited a year to offer this sacrifice, that meant that they'd spent a year taking care of it, feeding it, all of this. So there was a greater investment in it, and so therefore it's a greater sacrifice. So again, this is a person who's, I see your calf. How old is yours? Yeah, mine's a year old, right? It's this total one-upmanship in terms of their religious performance. And then that's obviously the case here. Thousands of rams, 10,000s of rivers of oil. And then shall I give my firstborn for transgression, right? Now taking it to the top. In ancient religion, it actually wasn't all that uncommon necessarily for people to sacrifice their own firstborn child before the Lord. Now, this was forbidden by Yahweh, but they seem to have forgotten this at certain times in Israelite history, and so it was seen as the ultimate sacrifice, right? What could be a bigger sacrifice than that? And so this is a way of bragging, boasting about how unbelievably religious they are, because they had come to think that this is what it meant to obey the law. The truth is, how many of us sometimes succumb to the same attitude? Of course, religion looks different in 21st century Christian America, but the principle is still the same. How many of us, the reality is, because we come to church every week, and because I'm faithfully involved in a Bible study, and because I read my Bible and I memorize Scripture, that simply by doing these things, right, this is what makes me right with God. And of course, Micah's whole point is a resounding no. None of that makes you right with God. That is not what God requires of us. So what is it that is required? What is it that the all-seeing mountains and hills are looking for? Let me see this then in verse 8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. This is Micah's way of summarizing the law. So let's look at this here. First of all, do justice. The word here in Hebrew is the word mishpat, a word that I've mentioned before. It's a word that it can be translated as judgment or justice, depending on the context, because, of course, those two things are closely related. The only difference between judgment and justice is which side of the gavel you happen to be on. If you are the one committing injustice, then when that gavel comes down, it is judgment. If you are the victim of injustice, then when that gavel comes down, it is justice. Now, this whole sort of courtroom scene, courtroom language, one of the things we need to see is the bigger picture that it's pointing to. What justice is making something that is wrong right. That's what it means to make justice. That the ultimate goal of justice is what another Hebrew word would sum this up, the Hebrew word shalom, which is a word that just means, it means peace, but it means so much more than that. It's a word that there is no English word that captures it, but it's a way of things being the way they're supposed to be. It's making the world the way it is supposed to be in any given situation. It's enabling human flourishing in every possible capability. It's just making everything right that is wrong. So the person who's doing justice is always looking, what can they do to make things better? And I think this is a little bit different than, again, sometimes our religious approach to following the law. We tend to think of it almost entirely in terms of what I shouldn't do, right? Don't do this, don't steal, don't murder, right? I mean, this comes from the Ten Commandments, right? We get that. Don't do this, don't do this. And it becomes this list of things that I shouldn't do. But the problem is that we miss out. In other words, religious people tend to be very big on avoiding sins of omission. But they don't always focus so much on the sin of, they're good at identifying sins of commission, right? Things that you do that are wrong, but they don't always identify sins of omission, things that they aren't doing that they should be doing. And so doing justice is a whole lot more than just avoiding the sin list. In fact, doing justice is about engaging a broken world. You see, the religious mentality can be the very opposite. That, well, let me seal myself off from the world, right? I don't want to be around those sinful people. Let me create my own little environment where there's no sin going on. Well, that misses the whole point of doing justice. No, we're called to engage our world, be involved in it, and seek to bring justice and shalom in whatever way that we can. And I remember thinking about, just to kind of expand your mind on what this means. A good friend of mine who I went to seminary with, after seminary, he got his degree in theology, and he realized after studying theology and beginning to understand some of these concepts about what it means to do justice, he went back to school and got a degree in urban planning. And now he serves in a local community helping to design how cities are laid out. Because what he came to discover is that a lot of injustice, a lot of brokenness in our world is actually exacerbated just by the way cities are set up. And that what needed to be done is some of those systems needed to be fixed in order to help foster a healthier community, to try to foster healthier relationships between the haves and the have-nots, for example. And so what he says, well, this is doing justice. It's fixing the ways in which the world are broken. I'm going to embarrass Alex Bear here for a minute. He didn't know I was going to do this. But I was talking with Alex. Alex is a manager at a Panda Express location, 104th and Federal, is that right? Yep. And I was talking to him about what he does there as the manager. And he was saying, and basically what I came to realize is that his job is to bring shalom. And it's to make what is right that which is wrong. And so he talked about, it's increasing productivity. It's about eliminating waste, both food waste and economic waste. But then, and I won't forget this, he said, actually, the most important thing is creating a healthy working environment. It's creating a culture where people feel valued. It's creating a culture where people can flourish. You see, that is doing justice. That's doing justice in the workplace. You see, when you begin to see it that way, you realize all of the opportunities in our daily lives that you don't need to separate your faith from your engagement in our world, right? So this is what it means to do justice. It means to make things right that are wrong. Okay, that's the first part. What does God require of us? To do justice. Then secondly, to love kindness. Kindness. And again, the Hebrew word here, kindness is an okay word. Some translations put mercy, love mercy. The truth is, once again, there really isn't an English word that captures what the Hebrew word hesed is really about. The Hebrew word hesed is a word that is often used in the Bible to refer to God's love for us. His love, his hesed towards us. A famous verse where this is seen, at least famous in the Minor Prophets, is in the book of Jonah, in probably the most famous scene in Jonah, when Jonah gets swallowed by the big fish. And he's down there in the belly of the fish, and he's beginning to, he's having a moment of realization, you might say, and he comes to see the error of his ways, and he repents from the belly of this fish, and he cries out to God, and he cries out for him to deliver him, and he appeals to God's hesed. He appeals to God's mercy. And what he's appealing to is God's covenantal loyalty. He's appealing to the fact that God has committed himself through the covenant he made with Moses. He has committed himself to Jonah and to his people. So what Jonah is doing is he's appealing to the loyalty of God. Now, when we take this word and apply it not to our relationship with God, but to our relationship with one another, we see the same thing. It's about loyalty to one another. Or if you then take it and pair it with what we've already seen, it's a commitment to doing justice. It's a commitment. It's a resolve to not give up. You see, I think some of us, we have like moments where, random acts of kindness. Just, I'm going to do something kind today. I'm going to go help somebody out. I'm going to go give money to this cause. I'm going to go help this person out. But the reality is it's kind of sporadic. It's here and there. And sometimes the truth is when we do those random acts of kindness, we're really just doing it to make us feel better about our generally consumeristic way of approaching life. But you see, when we combine doing justice with hesed, with this loyalty, what it means is it's a lifestyle. I am committed to doing justice with my life. I think for some of us, as we get older, we can kind of lose the idealism of youth. And we look at the world and we see how messed up it is, and there's nothing I can do about it. Right? And we give up. That is not what it means to love kindness. To love kindness is to give your life committed to doing justice and making right that which is wrong whenever we can. I love, many of you know, Betty Painter. She's increasingly over the last couple of years stepping back from her official role serving here. But here's the one thing we all know. Betty is never going to stop serving. As long as mercy allows her, right? As long as her mercy stick allows her, she's going to give. She told me once she doesn't believe in retirement. And I think that there's an important principle behind that we are, as long as you have breath in your lungs, we are called to love kindness, to a commitment to doing justice. What does God require of us? It's to do justice, to love kindness, love mercy, and then finally, to walk humbly with your God. Now here we see that when we look at the brokenness in this world, the number one thing that is broken is our relationship with God. And that this is the thing that must first be established. We see actually that all of the brokenness in the world stems out of the brokenness in our relationship with God. We see this when you look at, Cain and Abel, we find the brokenness between Cain and his brother Abel, but that comes after what? the fall. It comes after Adam's relationship with God is broken, and now that is passed on to his children and manifests itself in brokenness in that horizontal relationship. So for that horizontal relationship, for that kind of justice to be done at a horizontal level, first we've got to reestablish that relationship with God. That trying to fix problems in this world, trying to fix problems in your family, trying to fix problems in your marriage without first fixing your relationship with God is like trying to build a house without first laying the foundation. It is like trying to use an app on your phone without first putting an operating system on your phone. The first thing we must do is restore our relationship with God. And so what he's talking about here, walk humbly with your God. It's a relationship. It's walking in relationship with God. I think a verse that summarizes well what it means to walk with God humbly is Psalm 89, beginning in verse 15, says this: "Blessed are those who have learned to acclaim you, who walk in the light of your presence, O Lord. They rejoice in your name all day long." Now, when we begin to see this relational dynamic between us and God, it changes, I think, the way we understand Micah 6:8 when it says, "What does the Lord require of you?" Right? That word require, it can kind of sound like it has almost a transactional kind of quality to it. Sort of like, you go to the DMV and it's like, what do they require of you? And it's like, well, you need 13 pieces of identification and 17, pieces of paper that prove your address. It's very, very that's required of you. But that's not what this is. Right? In fact, the Hebrew word that is translated as require, it's actually a word that can also be translated as searching for. What is God searching for? What is God looking for? And even, what is God desiring of you? Okay, what does it mean to do justice, to love mercy? What does God require of us? What does obedience to his law look like? And it's to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, the question that emerges is, how do we become the kind of person for whom this kind of lifestyle is natural? And the answer is simply this: by remembering that God has already done this for you. We do justice, we love kindness, and we walk humbly with him. We walk in relationship with him because he's already done this. He's sought to bring justice into your life. He's sought you with kindness, and he's sought you out to be in relationship with you. And we actually see this in the verses that immediately precede this call to obedience, verses 3 through 5. Here, God speaking, he kind of voices a rhetorical question. It says this: "O my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me." And then he goes on and he says, look what I've done for you. He says, "For I brought you up out from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him, and what happened at Shittim and Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord." He's saying, look what I've done for you. And of course, what does he mention? He mentions how I delivered you from slavery in Egypt. I delivered you from the injustice, right? I brought justice to you by bringing you out of slavery in Egypt. He mentions the Balak, the king of Moab, and the conflict that they had. Here he's referring to an episode after they're delivered out of Egypt where they come into conflict with Moab, and Balak, the king, he tries to get this seer Balaam to pronounce judgment on Israel, but God won't let him God won't let the seer say anything but positive things. He won't let him do anything but bless Israel. And God's saying, look, I'm loving you. I'm caring for you. I'm protecting you. And then Shittim and Gilgal, that's a reference to the two places on either side of the Jordan River immediately when they passed through the Jordan. These are the two towns on either side of that. It's just a way of referring to the fact that he led them into the promised land. And he's saying, this is what I've done for you. And so once again, we see that when we read a verse like Micah 6:8, where we're called to do justly, to love mercy, it's always within the context of what God has done for us. And of course, most profoundly, where do we see God's justice, God's kindness, and him walking humbly with God? Well, we actually see that in Jesus. And Micah knows that. Micah knows that. What's interesting is that he references Jesus just a few verses before this. You know, I say that the minor prophets are often overlooked. Micah's often overlooked. Well, Micah is often overlooked, except at Christmas. Because notice what happens just a few verses before this in chapter 5. So the book of Micah, like most of the prophetic literature, it's a lot of judgment. The police officer, right, coming here telling you what you've done wrong. A lot of that. But as always the case, it always ends with restoration. It always ends with God bringing salvation. As we saw with Hosea, God just can't stay mad at you. He just can't do it. It's not in him. And so we see this once again. The first several chapters of Micah, a lot of judgment. But then he looks forward to a time of restoration. And look what he says. This is Micah 5, verses 2 through 3. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel. If that sounds familiar, of course, it is a passage that is then quoted in the Gospel of Matthew in reference to the coming of Jesus. In the person of Jesus Christ, God came to bring justice. As we saw last week on the cross, Jesus took the judgment that we deserve. He absorbed it himself so that we could be set free and experience shalom. We see his covenantal faithfulness, God's faithfulness, and that as you read through the Old Testament scriptures, his people turn away from him time and time and time again. But in the gospel, we see that he will not give up. He will not turn away, even if we hang him on a cross. That is his hesed, his loving kindness. We see Jesus the Son and his resolute willingness to walk with his heavenly Father, to be obedient to wherever he leads him, even if it leads him to the cross. You see, it's because of the gospel that we then respond in kind. We now come to our time of communion. And of course, what is communion all about? Communion is an opportunity for us to remember the justice, the mercy, the humility revealed in Jesus on our behalf. You see, it's actually at this point that we see the purpose of religion. Micah hounds on dead religion, but here we see the point of religion. As Micah shows us, religion is not there. We don't engage in religious activities to get God to love us. We don't engage in religious activities in order to show God that we love us. No, why do we engage in religious activities? You know what it's really for? It's actually to get us to love God. We engage in to remind ourselves of what God has done. We study the scriptures to remind ourselves of the faithfulness of God. We take communion. Why? Not to boast about anything we have done. Communion is a religious activity we engage in to remind us of the mercy of God. If you are here